Speaker. As a kid, I would sit with my uncle late at night on his car bonnet watching the planes taking off or landing at Sydney Airport. And fast forward to today, if you stand on the northern edge of my electorate on any given morning, you'll watch the planes lining up over Botany Bay, one after another, descending into Sydney Airport. And it is a visual Barton locals know very much so, because behind every one of those landings and takeoffs is a small force of my own constituents. They're baggage handlers, they're check-in staff, they're the cleaners, the caterers, the ground crew, the biosecurity officers checking bags at the carousel before anyone gets to go home. And Sydney Airport sits right on Barton's doorstep, and for thousands of families in Hurstville, Rockdale, Cogra and Bexley, it isn't just a piece of infrastructure, it's the family income. And that's the lens I bring to this piece of legislation, the Biosecurity Amendment Improving Operational Efficiency Bill 2026, not as a theoretical piece of border machinery, but as a legislation that touches on an industry my community works in, lives near and very much depends on, Deputy Speaker. And I want to start with something almost everyone in this chamber has experienced personally, standing in the arrivals hall after a very long haul flight, exhausted, filling out a paper form by hand, trying to remember exactly what farm you visited a couple of countries ago, then shuffling forward in a queue that never seems to actually move. That paper form is the incoming passenger card, and it has been part of the arrival experience for many decades. And it works in that sense that it gets the job done, but it's slow. It's manual, and in an age when almost everything else about air travel has gone digital, it increasingly feels a bit of a relic. Two previous attempts to digitise it between 2016 and 2022 didn't get across the line. But this bill is that third attempt, and unlike the first two, it's already proving itself in the real world. Since October 2024, a pilot program called the Australian Travel Declaration has been running on selected Qantas international flights, starting in Brisbane, expanding to Sydney in 2025 and to Melbourne this year. And instead of a paper card, travellers fill in their declaration on their phone and up to 72 hours before they even board. It generates a QR code sent straight to their email, while a Border Force officer simply scans on arrival. And as of May this year, more than 380,000 travellers had already gone through this system this particular way. In July, the government announced it would extend the digital declaration to every capital city before the end of the year, backed by $56.1 million over 4 years to build a web form version so that no traveller, regardless of which app they have or don't have, is left behind. For an airport that sits in my community's backyard, that's not a minor technical upgrade. It's the difference between a smooth Tuesday arvo at the terminal and a bottleneck at that ripples throughout every gate, every ground crew shift, every connecting flight. Let me put some scale around what our biosecurity system is actually managing. Last year alone, biosecurity officers intercepted more than 359,000 incoming travellers, carrying something of concern, and inspected over 280,000 air and sea consignments. Detector dogs, including the extra 20 this government has added to the front line, caught more than 42,000 items at our borders and mail centres in 2024, and over 10,000 of them were through the new dogs alone. Those aren't just statistics for a briefing note. Every one of those interceptions happened because a person was standing at a desk or a dog working a bag at an airport where my constituents go to work every single day. When traveller numbers keep climbing, and they are climbing, with Australia welcoming millions of visitors a year and Brisbane preparing particularly to host the Olympics, the volume passing through the system only grows. If we don't modernise how we collect basic biosecurity information, the strain doesn't fall on some faceless bureaucracy. It falls on the workforce at Sydney Airport, on the queues that snake back from immigration, and ultimately whether Barton locals actually get home on time after their shift. This legislation makes 3 changes to the Biosecurity Act 2015. First, it creates a clear, standing obligation for travellers arriving in Australia, passengers, crew, anyone in the charge of an aircraft or vessel, to provide the biosecurity information regulators need, in whatever form regulations prescribe. That's the legal foundation that lets the Australian Travel Declaration keep expanding as the paperless replacement for the incoming passenger card, covering the same essential questions: what goods you're carrying, where you've travelled, your occupation, just collected earlier, digitally, and with far fewer touch points between a traveller and an official. Second, it introduces a notice of intention process for businesses operating under approved arrangements, the agreements that let companies manage their own biosecurity risk under departmental oversight. Under this bill, if the department is proposing to refuse an application or attach conditions to it, the business gets advance notice and a genuine opportunity to respond before that decision is finalised. This is not a new concept invented from scratch. It puts into law a practice the department already follows informally. But writing into legislation matters because it gives industry participants certainty, and it gives them a proper avenue to be heard rather than simply being told after the fact. Third, the bill fixes a drafting error concerning the powers of Inspector General of Biosecurity to request relevant information during a review. A small but important piece of legislative housekeeping that ensures independent oversight of our biosecurity system actually functions the way Parliament always intended it to. I note for the House that none of the regulation-making powers in this bill are exempt from parliamentary disallowance. Every regulation made under the new traveller information obligation remains subject to the Parliament's scrutiny, which is exactly where that scrutiny belongs. Listening to people who actually use it, what struck me the most in reviewing the evidence before the Senate committee inquiry into this bill is how broad the support is and how thoughtfully conditional some of it is too. Industry has been asking for this for years. The Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry has recommended digitising border processes in successive pre-budget submissions. The Tourism and Transport Forum called it practical, achievable and long overdue. The Australian Airports Association surveyed travellers and found 71% wanted a digital option. Sydney Airport itself told the committee this bill provides an important legislative foundation for a more efficient, secure and technology-enabled border environment. But I think the most important voices in this debate are the ones asking us not to rush the substance of biosecurity protection in the name of speed. The National Farmers Federation put it plainly at last year's Economic Reform Roundtable. Our biosecurity is a non-negotiable, and any change to the paperwork has to prove it strengthens border protection, not just streamlines it. The Queensland Farmers Federation made a very similar point, stressing that cybersecurity has to be a genuine pillar of any digital system, not an afterthought. Canberra Airport, even as it has welcomed the change, reminded us that the declaration process has to stay accessible for travellers who face barriers using digital technology, older travellers, people without smartphones, and people who simply aren't confident online. And when I think about that, that is a very true reflection when I think about my grandparents when they travel. I think those are the right instincts, and they're the instincts that this bill actually tried to build in. The regulations remain disallowable. A web form option is funded specifically so no one is forced to rely solely on an airline's app. And the underlying information being collected doesn't change. We are not lowering the bar on what biosecurity risks we're already screening for. We're changing how efficiently we screen for it. Deputy Speaker, at the end of the day, I think the bill is about two things at once. It's about protecting Australia's farm food security and environment at the border, and making sure that people who work that border, many of them who live in my electorate, who are also members of the mighty United Workers Union, I must say, but aren't carrying that weight of a system that's very much stuck in 2005 vibes. And every time I drive past the airport, I see the queues at the drop-off, I think about the shift workers heading in and the exhausted families heading out, all of them relying on a system that must be quite rigorous but also fair. And I believe this bill doesn't compromise on that rigour. And what it does is finally brings a much fairer, a much clearer system for the industry. As a person who's also the chair of the Sydney Airport Community Forum, this is something that would be of quite interest for the participants in this forum, who look at a lot of things outside of the scope, particularly on LTOPs and sounds of aircrafts, but is something quite relevant around the functions of the operations of Sydney Airport, which is really pertinent. And I think for them, this is an important step to also make it clearer for Sydney Airport, but also for the workers and travellers. I commend the bill to the House.